Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the international affairs, foreign policy, and global development community, and world news aficionados of all stripes. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. For the last several months, Niger has experienced a surge in attacks against civilians by violent extremists. This includes a spate of attacks in March in which hundreds of civilians have been killed. In one particularly egregious act of violence, men on motorbikes conducted coordinated assaults on 3 villages, killing over 130 civilians. This region of West Africa, known as the Sahel, has experienced profound and growing security challenges in recent years. But according to my guest today, Ornella Moderan, what distinguishes this new upsurge in violence in Niger is that civilians are being targeted and on the basis of their ethnicity. Ornella Moderan is the Sahel program head for the Institute for Security Studies, and I caught up with her recently from Niamey, Niger. She was in Niamey, the capital, for a significant moment in the history of that country. On April 2nd, for the first time since Niger's independence in 1960, there was a peaceful transfer of power from one civilian leader to the next. Now, that almost did not happen because just a few days earlier, there was an attempted coup, which was repelled. We kick off discussing what is driving increasing violence in the southwest of Niger, where these recent attacks have taken place, and then we turn to a conversation about recent political events in the country. Towards the end of the interview, Ornella Moderan makes some important points about the efficacy of a military strategy to combat violent extremism in the Sahel that is being undertaken by a coalition of countries in the region and backed by France. This coalition is called the G5 Sahel, and Ornella Moderan argues for a more comprehensive approach to insecurity in the region, or at least one that does not rely solely on military force. So I was glad to have Ornella Moderan back on the podcast. Earlier last year, she was part of a panel discussion that I hosted on the podcast about the links between climate and security in the region, and I'll post a link to that episode in the show notes. And I also must say just how pleased I was with the audio quality of this episode, which was recorded from Niamey, Niger. At one point, you'll hear the power is cut where she is speaking from, but the Zoom gods looked favorably upon us that day, and our conversation was uninterrupted. And one final request, if you are a regular listener to the show, if you listen to the show week in, week out, I would so appreciate it if you could leave a review of the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever it is that you listen to the show. I love reading about how this show impacts your life and how you derive value from it. Thank you. All right, now here is my conversation with Ornella Moderan of the Institute for Security Studies.
The second half of March has been a particularly difficult moment for the western part of Niger. So I think you're referring to the attacks that occurred in particular in the regions of Tillabéri, bordering Mali and Burkina Faso, as well as in the region of Tawa, bordering Mali. So what happened essentially is 2 main attacks. One occurred on the 16th of March. This would seemingly have been an attack perpetrated by violent extremist groups, probably the ISGS group, which is the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, although they didn't claim it. Specifically targeting individuals, a group of people coming back from a market in in the location called Bani Bangu. So what was new with this type of approach is that not only it's the interception of an entire group of people, so official figures for that specific attack are 66 casualties, civilians. But in that particular case, there seems to have been an ethnic or community targeting, which is something that's very new in Niger. It's not something that the Niger context has seen a lot of before, unlike other neighboring countries.
Is the idea that it used to be that a lot of these attacks were simply banditry, but now you're seeing this ethnic component of these kinds of mass atrocity events?
It's a little bit more complex than that. So if you look at the history, at the recent history of the conflict in Western Niger, so in the regions of Tillabéri and Tawa, you can kind of clearly see several waves of insecurity. So it started mainly with the targeting of local authorities, village elders, chefs de canton, and other local figureheads of state authority that were being targeted by violent extremist groups. So this was kind of the first wave of targeting. And then after that, probably in response to the Niger state's reaction, which was to deploy more defense and security personnel in these parts of the country, a second wave of attacks specifically targeted those defense and security forces. So you could see major attacks like the one that happened in Inates or in Chinegodar at the end of 2019 and beginning of 2020, which killed hundreds of Nigerian soldiers specifically. But around those times, so civilians were still not being targeted as a main target. Criminality and banditry occurred, but it didn't seem to have necessarily or always a terrorist component, and it definitely didn't reach the kind of extent that we started seeing since this year. Now, the third wave, which is what we are discussing now, is something that started at the beginning of this year. So on the 3rd of January this year, a mass attack, first of its kind, happened in the western part of Niger, targeting 2 villages reported to have challenged the authority of terror groups. And those 2 attacks killed a total of at least 100 civilians. This was on the 3rd of January. Then on the 16th of March happened the incident which I just mentioned. And shortly after that, on the 21st of March, happened a third incident in the district of Tilia, where an entire village was attacked and at least 137, again, civilians this time, were killed. So this shows a new trend in the conflict dynamics in the western part of Niger, which is about direct targeting of entire populations, of entire civilians. The point that you're mentioning about ethnic dynamics is an interesting one, because it seems that whoever is perpetrating these attacks is trying to play that card. This is not something that has had very strong grounds in the Niger, especially in the Western Niger context until now, but there seems to be a sort of attempt by the violent extremist groups perpetrating these attacks to create a narrative around ethnic identity, around inter-community conflicts, or even to start a vicious circle, a retaliation circle, almost by pitching communities against each other's.
It serves the strategic interests of this Islamic State offshoot, the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, to foment these ethnic divisions in some way?
Absolutely, in the sense that, well, this is as old as the world itself, divide to rule. So it's not clear what the strategic intent at the end of the day exactly is, but it could be about subcontracting violence to various communities so that they take up this dynamic on their own. It could be about clearing up this that part of the country, especially along the border with Mali, as an area of operation, or as a base, or as a back position. It could be about challenging specific authorities, either at a national or at a local level. So many things could be playing in, and it's still not clear exactly what the end game is, which I guess is one of the most concerning factors, because it's, of course, very difficult to establish a response strategy to a problem which is still difficult to grasp.
So these attacks that have increased in frequency in late March come at a time of political significance in Niger. The country was to have its first peaceful transition of power since 1960, but that was potentially briefly interrupted with a failed coup attempt that also happened in late March. Can you just sort of describe and set up the political transition that has since occurred in Niger?
I think you said most of it, actually. So since the independence of Niger in 1960, the country has known 4 military coups. And this year was the first time that the relay was being passed between one democratically elected civilian head of state, president, to another. The inauguration of then President-elect Bazoum, who is now the president, occurred on the 2nd of April, so just a few days ago. And as you mentioned, it occurred in a context of course, high tension in the country and high emotion related to the acceleration of attacks on civilians during the second half of March. But it also occurred in a context where there was an attempted coup in the very last days in the very last days before inauguration. So very little information has filtered on what exactly happened, but one thing that was made public is the fact that a small group of military officers would have attempted by night, 3 a.m., to take over the power. They did not manage, and a round of arrests followed in the next following days. And this did not impeach the peaceful political transition. However, I think it's important to also mention that President Bazoum's inauguration also took place in a context of political tension within the political class itself. So it's important to distinguish the attempt by some military actors on one hand, and the ongoing contentious between political actors and political parties. So some very high-figure political leaders are still imprisoned to this day, and this is in a context where political dialogue across party lines in Niger has been in a stalemate at least since 2016. So this will definitely be one of the challenges of the new power in terms of building a collective dynamic that brings various parties together.
I mean, is there any direct connection between the political stalemate that you described and the worsening security situation in parts of the country?
Nothing really suggests that. And I guess this is one of the elements that can be difficult to understand from outside of the Sahel, but nothing really suggests any such connection. So on the one hand, you have a very tense political scene domestically, and then you have the worsening of security dynamics, which is probably more linked to regional dynamics, to the broader Sahel context, and perhaps to some level, probably to some level, I should say, the evolution of violent extremist group strategies themselves. But I really couldn't make a direct link between the two elements.
And so you're in Niamey right now, in this moment of the first peaceful transition of power in the country's history since post-independence. Like, what's the mood on the street or among the people that you're speaking with?
It's a lot of business as usual, but it's also a lot of wondering what's going to come next. The new president was elected on an agenda of continuity. I think it's important for listeners to know that President Mohamed Bazoum, before being elected, was a member of the previous government. He has run the Ministry of Security for several years and has also occupied other official functions in the past. So this is definitely not a newcomer in the political game or in the governance of the country. However, on Inauguration Day, the speech that he delivered suggested some level of change, actually. So he presented an agenda, which is an agenda focused on a few very well articulated priorities, which include education, which include security, and which include governance. While this is not new in the sense that it was part of his campaign discourse, the way in which it was presented made some observers wonder whether this would really be about continuity or, what type of governance exactly does he have in mind, and what are the changes he wants to bring to the country?
What would you expect in terms of the government response to growing insecurity in parts of Niger to be the same or different from how the government has previously responded to insecurity in parts of the country?
So the government of Niger has generally been quite reactive to these developments. So right now, the core of the insecurity is happening in the western part of the country, but a few years ago, it was in the eastern part of Niger, in the region of Difa, which is quite heavily affected by the Boko Haram crisis. So President Bazoum comes with, as I mentioned, an experience of these issues. He has been leading the country's policy on security for quite some time. Oh, Mark?
Yes. Yes.
Hello.
Yes.
So yeah. Okay, I just had a power cut, so I wondered if you could still hear me.
I could still hear you.
Okay, so
let's keep going. I have faith in the power grid of Niamey. Let's keep going.
So indeed, he has a security background at high levels of decision making, including as a minister, and he has also shown quite some pragmatism in addressing these issues. So during a recent interview, for instance, he mentioned that in the past he had already expressed willingness to initiate dialogue with all kinds of violent actors, potentially including terrorist groups, if they wanted to negotiate. So this is something that I think should be taken seriously, as the issue of whether or not to negotiate with terror groups is increasingly coming back in the region. Now, one of the things I didn't mention earlier while painting the general security context is that Niger is also part of the G5 Sahel. So the G5 Sahel is this group of 5 countries, Mauritania, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad, that have come together since 2014 to try and establish a common framework for, well, initially for development and then extended, especially since 2017, to security as well, with the establishment of a joint force. Recently, Chad has sent a contingent of its joint force to the western part of Niger, where this insecurity is happening, in order to support the stabilization of this zone, so of the western part of Niger, but also the northern part of Burkina Faso, just across the border. The reason why this is important, I think, is not only because it speaks to Niger's openness to regional cooperation and collaboration on security issues, but also because this deployment has raised additional questions in terms of really what the price of counterterrorism for civilians is. The Chadian battalion that was deployed to the western part of Niger has been reported to commit atrocities, including raping community women, including an 11-year-old child, during the first 2 weeks of their deployment. This has created major turmoil in the country and in the region. It was documented and substantiated by the National Human Rights Commission of Niger, which prompted very strong reactions both from Chad authorities and from the G5 Sahel Joint Force itself. So while of course, this is an encouraging development that such strong reactions of condemnation and commitment to have the perpetrators of these acts be held accountable are good signals. What's very concerning, I think, is that the counter-terrorist agenda and counter-terrorist operations are really doing quite some harm to civilians in their way. So this is a recent example. Other examples outside of Niger could be, for instance, the controversies over the French strike on Bounty village in Mali, which also reportedly killed at least 19 civilians gathered at a wedding, according to MINUSMA. So this raises a bigger question of really what's the cost of this counterterrorism fight?
For as long as I've been interviewing people and covering the situation in the Sahel, it seems that one of the drivers of conflict and instability has persistently been the overreaction of counterterrorism forces by the government against civilian populations. And that causes this sort of reaction against the government and causes this cycle of violence to continue.
Exactly. So this is an element or an indication, I think, of the need to rethink the way states fight terrorism in this region. So far, we have seen a lot of very militarized responses that either purposefully or mistakenly fail the human rights of local communities and, well, more generally, just the protection of civilians. This is extremely counterproductive in the sense that the type of, of course, aside from the ethical and legal problems that this poses, it's also just very much counterproductive from a very strategic and operational perspective, because the fight that counter-terrorist forces are putting is one that cannot be won without the support, without the collaboration of local populations. So the question really is, how do you expect to get the support of civilian communities that you also victimize? And this is something that has repeatedly come up in conversations with various stakeholders here in Niamey during our, over the last couple of weeks, this notion that, well, we really don't know on which sides the terrorists are. Maybe they are on both sides, because our terror, our fear comes from both sides.
So, earlier you described that it's really regional dynamics that are driving insecurity and these terrorist attacks throughout the Sahel. And the response has been regional as well through the G5 Sahel, but it's been overly militarized. So what would perhaps a demilitarized or more comprehensive or perhaps even like enlightened approach to security look like in the region?
Looking at the way counterterrorism is performed in the Sahel, these seem like a bit of an afterthought. So it's very difficult sometimes to see how the official lip service actually translates into realities on the ground. And this requires things like, of course, training, but it also requires political leadership. It requires a much more collaborative and community sensitive. I'm definitely not the only person saying this, and there are entire organizations and coalitions of organizations that have been pushing for an agenda that would be people-centered and that would go beyond the military part to also address the underlying governance issues. So these governance issues include things like, the lack of access to basic social services and basic needs for rural communities, things like water, things like health, things like education. This also links to bigger national challenges in terms of governance, such as corruption and transparency in public administration. These are key elements that are really part of the underlying factors for conflicts and violence, which need to be addressed just as much as an immediate military response is needed. And then last but not least, I think prevention. So counterterrorism is very reactive when really a lot of these structural responses to governance deficiencies could help address root causes and have a much more effective prevention approach.
The lack of this comprehensive approach to security in the region and the terrorist attacks that are ongoing must be causing some sort of profound humanitarian crisis. What does that look like right now?
Absolutely. I mean, it looks like forced displacement. Thousands of households fleeing their villages, either because they have been attacked before or because they are likely or feel likely to be attacked in the future. This, of course, creates a lot of pressure on host communities as well. It creates a high level of humanitarian needs. So this, I think, is an important development also, especially in the context where the humanitarian response is both underfunded in Niger as well as in all other Sahel countries. But in the context of Western Niger, it's also very much, it's also, what's the word? Okay. It's also very much hampered by access issues. Humanitarian access is extremely difficult, and it's one of the key elements of discussion, conversation, negotiation between the humanitarian community on one side and the Niger government on the other.
Ornella, thank you so much for your time. This was very helpful. And I thank you. And I'm glad that I was able to reach you today in Niamey.
Thank you very much, Mark. It was a pleasure.
All right. Big thank you to Ornella. That was very helpful. And I'll certainly be following broader issues surrounding the G5 Sahel and security in this region. If you are particularly focused on this region, I recommend you check out other recent episodes, including conversations about the situation in Nigeria, in Burkina Faso, and elsewhere. And today's episode is supported in part through a grant from the Carnegie Corporation of New York to showcase African voices on peace and security issues. To view other episodes in this series, please visit globaldispatchespodcast.com, and a disclaimer that the opinions and views expressed in this episode belong exclusively to those of us who expressed them. All right, we'll see you next time. Bye.